Whose ear did Peter cut off, and why is John the only gospel to identify this man's name? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of John on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to John chapter 18. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 11. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So John chapter 8, beginning at verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, which was there, and where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" Over the last 15 lessons, we've been looking at Jesus' discourse in the upper room. While the other three Gospels focused on what occurred surrounding the meal and the eating of the Lord's Supper, John chose to focus on Jesus' thoughts after the meal. These were designed to show the disciples more proof of his deity in that he would die, rise again, and return to heaven. His deity is especially seen in Jesus' prayer of unity in John 17 before they leave for the Garden of Gethsemane. In that prayer, Jesus prays that he received the glory that he had before the world was, and the glory that only God has. Coming now to chapter 18, we have the disciples and Jesus going to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is outside Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley on the Mount of Olives. From the Mount of Olives, one could see Jerusalem, so it wasn't a long journey, and it is one that Jesus often made while in Jerusalem, which is how Judas knew where to look. The other Gospels make it clear that Jesus continued talking with the disciples along the way, but John leaves those details out, having covered many of the same themes already. John passes over Jesus' prayers in the garden, jumping to the events of Judas' arrival. Judas, of course, didn't come alone, but he received from the Pharisees and chief priests a detachment of troops. They came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. The lanterns and torches is easy to explain, for it was night, and unlike us who have street lights to help guide our way, no such light existed in those days. Therefore, if you're climbing the Mount of Olives in the middle of the night without a lantern and a torch, you're very likely to trip and fall. Why, though, did they come with some weapons? Because they expected a fight. People generally don't like being arrested, especially without cause, so it's very easy to see why the soldiers thought that there would be a fight and that they would need protection. Upon arriving in the garden, Jesus went forward and said to them whom they were seeking, to which their response was Jesus of Nazareth. When they heard that Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now it is uncertain as to why they did this. Perhaps it was out of surprise that Jesus would identify himself. Since John doesn't mention it specifically, perhaps when they fell back to the ground is when Judas went up and kissed Jesus in order to identify Jesus to the soldiers. Jesus asked the soldiers again whom they were seeking, and again said Jesus, to which Jesus replied that he had already said that he was the one whom they were looking for. And since that was so, he requested that his disciples be let go. Of course, this showed Jesus' great love for his disciples in that he didn't want them to die with him. But John also says in verse 9 that it was done so that what he spoke might be fulfilled. Now, this statement isn't referring to the Old Testament scripture, but what Jesus said himself in John 17, verse 12. Simon Peter, though, desiring to save Jesus' life, took the sword that he had and cut off the right ear of the high priest's servant, who John identifies as Malchus. Now it is interesting that all four gospel accounts tell this story, but only John identifies the disciple who cut off the ear as Peter, and only John identifies the servant of the high priest as Malchus. Why do you suppose that is? Perhaps it has something to do with when this gospel was written. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were likely written while Peter was still alive, and perhaps Malchus too. Therefore, to protect Peter from reprisals from the current high priest, the story was told by these three gospel writers, but the perpetrator left as a mystery. However, the Gospel of John was written long after Peter had died, and likely Malchus too, so there would be no danger to Peter to identify him here. Of course, this is just my speculation, and so we shouldn't be dogmatic about it. Jesus, though, told Peter to put his sword away, for he was going to be arrested and drink of the cup that God the Father had given him, the cup that he had been telling the disciples about all evening. And even though John doesn't say so, the other Gospels tell us that Jesus healed Malchus's ear, meaning that even though Peter had done wrong, no harm was done, allowing Peter and the other disciples to escape. We'll continue with this story, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of John chapter 18, verses 12 to 24, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.